Hello, welcome to Context, where we conduct careful inspection and examination of the top stories of the day. I'm Orkhan Amashov. The recent conversation between US President Donald Trump and Russian leader Vladimir Putin can be deemed as signaling the continuation of a potential shift in diplomatic engagement over the Ukraine conflict. Over the course of an hour and a half, both leaders agreed to a 30-day suspension of Russian strikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure and initiated discussions on a maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea. While these developments suggest tactical progress, a broader resolution remains elusive. Moscow continues to demand an end to Western military aid to Ukraine, an issue notably absent from the US summary of the talks. In the meantime, the UK's Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, signalled that Britain and its European allies are planning to speed up arms shipments to Ukraine ahead of a full ceasefire, which many analysts appear to think as testifying to the overall indubitable complexity of the whole picture. President Trump's diplomatic approach towards Russia has consistently diverged from what one may call conventional US policy pursued under the previous administration, favoring engagement over confrontation. His latest discussions with President Putin seem to reflect an effort to balance de-escalation with broader strategic interests. However, whether this partial limited ceasefire eventually translates into meaningful long-term stability depends on geopolitical calculations and the willingness of all parties to compromise, and perhaps many other relevant moments of import that we will try to reflect upon today. And joining me now to discuss the latest developments are Andrei Terezhenko, former Ukrainian diplomat and advisor to the Prosecutor General of Ukraine in 2014 and 15, joining from Basel, Switzerland. Mr. Alec Kazman, Protect Ukraine Now organization, joining from Chicago, United States. And Professor Mark Meyrovich, Professor of State University of New York Maritime College. Welcome to all of you, gentlemen.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Mr. Terezhenko, I would like to put my first question to you. We understand that agreeing on a deal, be it a full ceasefire or partial one, is one thing, but ensuring its swift implementation is another. Russia and Ukraine effectively launched air attacks, damaging each other's infrastructure almost immediately after the telephone conversation between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. And we also know that Russian forces carried out drone attacks on 2 hospitals in Ukraine. What is your reading of the current situation in general?
We have to understand that the peace talks that are happening throughout these last years, they're not just today's peace talks with Trump and Vladimir Putin, which are the most important ones, and hopefully they'll lead to some result of actual peace in Ukraine. But this is a proxy war between the United States and Russia. The Secretary of State Rubio confirmed this, not just my words. And we remember all those peace talks before, when Ukraine's army was surrounded, or they were having a lot of losses. They had the Minsk I, Minsk II. Then when Kyiv were surrounded, the Istanbul agreements, and never Ukraine followed in on those agreements at all. Unfortunately, as my government, Kyiv regime, put a law on those agreements, signed them, ratified them in the UN with the Minsk agreement, signed them in Istanbul, and then regrouped the army and tried to attack more and more, and we're getting more and more losses in this situation. So today's a follow-up with the phone conversation. Maybe just the beginning, maybe a misunderstanding, but it's not leading to peace at all from both sides, unfortunately. And I think the phone call is between the United States and Russia, first of all. They need to settle their differences, and then Ukraine and everything else will be put on, and is on the table, but will be discussed and moved in furthermore. Depends on what Ukraine's government decides in this situation, because they're putting out red lines, which are already not talkable in anybody in the world. NATO, nobody wants Ukraine into NATO. This is World War III. And this conflict would have never started if Ukraine would, just the United States would just support and say Ukraine will not join NATO. It's a red line. No, but they've moved forward. And this is why we have today's conflict in Ukraine and millions of people dead from both sides and Russians and Ukrainians are suffering.
Mr. Katzman, Ukraine does have its own red lines. It's about Ukraine's territorial integrity, its sovereignty, about certain essential linchpins to which President Zelensky referred to on a number of occasions. And Russia has got its own red lines. What is your reflection on this latest telephone conversation? And do you think that things are going to change or not?
Well, this latest phone conversation underscores that Putin understands only language of force. As we could see immediately after the phone call, that he continued bombarding Ukraine territory, infrastructure, and hitting civilians. So the only language, again, that he will understand is force, and the only peace ever possible in Ukraine is peace through strength. And for that reason, Ukraine must be supported militarily to a degree where it can deter any future aggression. And I would like to disagree with Andrew that the war started over NATO. Ukraine was never asking to be a NATO member before full-scale aggression. And frankly, at this point in time, I'm not even sure if NATO is in a position to defend Ukraine. And in fact, we see insufficient production in the West. We see insufficient readiness to deter any aggression against Europe itself. So again, Ukraine is fighting for its survival. People on the front line defending their homeland, their women, their children against rape, torture, and other crimes against humanity that Russia is conducting on Ukraine's territory. It is up to NATO and West, United States, to put their act together finally and support independence of Ukraine. And what we witnessed today is an attempt to normalize the relationship with Russia, which is going to be a segue to a next aggression, next war. The biggest mistakes that the United States has made was in 1991 when they forgave Russia for every crime they have committed in the past, and they decided to normalize those relationships.
Professor Marowitz, we realize, and this was the element entailed in my question to Mr. Telizhenko, that it's one thing to agree on something and it's a completely another thing actually to implement it properly. We understand that at this stage we're talking about a partial ceasefire, not a full one. And we also understand that some of the issues related to maritime ceasefire could have been discussed during the course of that telephone conversation. In your judgment, what specific terms could have been actually discussed for the proposed maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea, and how do you see their potential prospective enforcement?
Well, I think these are moot points. I don't think these are relevant points. We don't even know what they agreed to, because obviously it didn't take root.
Yeah.
You ask your question, will peace take root? It's completely impossible to understand whether there can be peace if we don't know what they talked about or what they agreed to. Because, for example, the readout of the Russians was different than the readout of the United States. I believe the readout of the Russians said that there will be no military or intelligence support for Ukraine.
Yeah.
But the U.S. readout didn't say that. So since we don't know exactly what they agreed to, it's impossible to understand it. Furthermore,
Professor Marowitz, we also know, terribly sorry for my interjection, I'm terribly sorry. We know that,
Yes.
I think we know that, we're given to understand that Russians rejected full ceasefire on the basis that Americans did not agree to cease that intelligence support for Ukraine. That
wasn't my point.
Yeah.
That wasn't my point.
Yeah.
My point was, you want to analyze what the agreement is, but we don't know what the agreement is.
Yeah.
And in terms of the ceasefire, whether this is technically a ceasefire or not, we don't know. The truth of the matter is, where we sit right now, we have absolutely no concept whatsoever as to whether there's going to be peace or not, because Ukraine wasn't in the table. Ukraine wasn't on the phone call. The Europeans are not on the phone call. Everybody needs to be on this phone call. The United States is pivotal, clearly. And President Trump is pivotal, clearly. but we need everybody in here to understand what we're doing and whether we are reaching peace or we're just reaching some illusion or delusion of peace, which is exactly what is happening in all the other conflicts in the world where there's wishful thinking for peace. And that's what we have here. Wishful thinking that maybe there'll be peace, but then there isn't any. So I am very pessimistic based on what this was agreed to, since you actually said that it was violated right away.
Yeah.
So I don't think that we have a road to peace here because we're not clarifying what it was that they agreed to. So I think that's a pivotal point.
Yeah.
And I would love to hear from the other guests as to what they think is the basis for a peace agreement. Because so far, I don't really see it as a clarification as to, you talk about the Black Sea and you're talking about the energy infrastructure. Is that a ceasefire or is that just a piecemeal agreement about something that goes on in one track and then on the other track, the war continues? So I'm still confused, I have to admit, as to whether or not what we're talking about here actually leads to anything concrete.
Mr. Terezhenko, Professor Marowich said that he's very confused because on the basis of the two separate readouts, actually it's very difficult to establish with any degree of certainty what actually was the actual content of that conversation, what has been agreed upon. What is your feeling in the midst of this uncertainty and divergent interpretations? What are the fundamental terms that you believe, you assume that two sides are actually discussing at this juncture and will continue to discuss this Sunday?
Well, we have to understand, diplomacy is all done behind closed doors. Whatever we see public is one thing, and then whatever we see behind closed doors is another thing, and that's what leads to the real peace. And from the conclusion of what we're talking about here, Ukraine was begging to go into NATO. Ukraine put NATO into its constitution, which is in it right now, and that's where they're pushing to join NATO. So there is a clear point of this provocation from the Ukrainian government at that time, during Poroshenko and then with Zelensky. They could have implemented the Minsk agreement, they could have got this war done, it would be over, Ukraine could have had Donbass as an autonomy, and there would be no bloodshed more than was spilled before this, with the civil war in Donbass. So today we're talking about what could lead to peace. The situation in Ukraine, where Ukraine was built as anti-Russia, by the foreign coup in 2014 and afterwards, the last 10 years, where I was in the government, and I think God left that government. And I saw what was happening from the United States and the G7 ambassadors going around telling what to do and how Ukraine to push against Russia and to seize anything former Soviet and former Russian history that we had together, which we were part of one country for more than 350 years. Today, Ukraine is being put this flag on the table and was used by the former Biden administration to wage this war against Russia. This war started in 2022. It was started in 2014 and even before this, in 2024. So this is what we see today. Ukraine needs to change its government to a neutral government, have elections, because today's president is illegitimate by the Constitution of Ukraine. Article 110 of the Constitution of Ukraine limits him to 4 years. Only the parliament has the legitimacy to prolong its power during the military conflicts and wars, even though Ukraine has no official war against Russia. They never announced it. So today, change of government leading to elections with a new government that will bring peace to Ukraine and sign peace agreements with Russia and let the United States leave Ukraine alone, get its sovereignty back. And this is the only way to peace.
Mr. Kasman, I mean, we talked about Western military aid to Ukraine. It's still underway. UK and its European allies still supporting Ukraine. And also the United States, of course, naturally continues to support Ukraine. It has been said that one of the Russian conditions is that for a full ceasefire to be attained, this support should end. What is your reflection on this particular point? Because European allies are effectively saying that for Ukraine to be able to negotiate a very sensible peace deal, its position must be strong. Bearing in mind this dichotomy, which we observe within the confines of these negotiations, would you say that peace is not just in the offing, but it is unlikely as long as this particular stage of the negotiations are concerned?
Not only the pieces in question, it's quite impossible the way it is right now. Russia needs to leave Ukrainian territory, and definitely Ukraine needs to be in a position to at least deter Russia from any future aggression. The way it is right now, Russia only underscores their aggressive intent to occupy Ukraine fully at some point in time, at least. All these peace talks really add up to nothing until Ukraine is able to defend itself successfully. Again, NATO is not what it used to be. It's not in a position to defend itself. It's not in a position to defend Ukraine the way it is right now. It should take the remaining assets, the frozen $300 billion they still have available, invest that heavily in weapons production for Ukraine, in Ukraine, and that's the only way to assure Russia will never try again any future aggression.
Professor Marowitz, what incentives, if any, could actually realistically encourage Russia and Ukraine to engage in more meaningful peace talks? We talk about trilateral format here. US is talking to Ukraine separately, and US is talking to Russia separately, and then these two tracks should sort of transmogrify into some form of trilateral format. What are the incentives that could make these two countries to come to terms and sign a deal in one way or the other?
See, I don't see it that way. I see the tracks like this. Russia talks to Russia. Russia talks to Russia. The U.S. talks to the U.S. Trump decides what he wants to decide. And then he lets Ukraine know what he decided. It doesn't really work. We saw the Oval Office meeting with Zelensky. That was a catastrophe. And, you know, look, there's a lot of local politics going on here in all the levels that we're talking about. But in American politics, as an American analyst looking at this as a political point of view, the United States is pivotal to this. And there is a real schism between the Democrats and the Republicans in terms of supporting the Ukraine war. Furthermore, President Trump wants to get an end to this war. He wants the Nobel Peace Prize. He wants to be recognized for that. But in order to do that, we need to have real peace. We don't need peace like Neville Chamberlain's peace, a peace in our time when he went to meet with Hitler. I'm not comparing anybody to anything. I'm just saying that was not peace. That was just more war. We really need all the parties here to commit to end the war for real. And if you're asking me whether this ceasefire is actually an end to the war, it is an end to anything because it's a small piecemeal agreement which relates to specific sectors which are questionable as to why they've been selected. And many of the analysts who've looked at it are very skeptical about it, from Ambassador Bolton to others who've looked at it and have said they really don't see it as a pathway or trajectory to real peace. This is why I keep asking the answer to the question, is there going to be peace? I don't see it. Now, about NATO, yes, that's a very important point. NATO is very important, and Europe is very important. And Europe needs to step up and defend itself and make a strong NATO. But Ukraine isn't going to enter NATO because the United States isn't going to allow it. And it has to be a unanimous decision. So that is not the pathway. The pathway is for a real ceasefire, which I know Ukraine agreed to. After Ukraine agreed to a 30-day ceasefire, Trump had his phone call, and suddenly we're doing this confusing piecemeal agreement, which we're really not sure where it goes long range. So my point back to you is to try to understand how to conceptualize a peace agreement, which means that the war will end and the horrible killing of our innocents will end. This is the main point. All these other things are completely
Professor Marovich,
confusing to me. I still don't have an
I would like to put to my last question. We literally have 40 seconds. I know it's very limited time. You talked about schism between Democrats and Republicans. What's about the transatlantic alliance and schism between European allies of the United States and Washington? 3-4 weeks ago, we saw America siding with Russia against the United Kingdom and France. What do you make of that?
Look, President Trump is a very complex figure. What to make of it is very hard to know what it all means. I think that at the end of the day, the United States is going to have to get together with Europe to solve this problem, period. And there's no other way around it. And we're going to get there eventually with the transatlantic alliance intact. That's how I see it. There's no other alternative.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm most grateful to all of you. Andrei Terezhenko, Adi Kasman, and Professor Marovich. Most grateful to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's all for now. As ever, the tides of diplomacy shift, but will they bring calm, tranquility, or more turbulence and perturbation? Naturally, time will tell. Until next time, stay informed, stay sharp, and take nothing for granted. I'm Orkhan Amashov, signing off. See you very soon.